Sometimes the most broken souls find each other in the most unexpected places. When a battle-scarred giant named Gunnar Stonefist saved a wild stallion from certain death, neither man nor beast knew they were about to save each other. No one in the north dared tame the horse called Vindrskuggi, Wind Shadow. The stallion had thrown every rider who tried to claim him. One morning, Gunnar found the beast hanging from a crumbling cliff ledge. Most would have let him fall, but Gunnar tied rope to his wrist and pulled, inch by inch, breath by breath, until both collapsed alive. What followed was a quiet dance of trust. Days turned to weeks as Gunnar fed and watched Vindrskuggi. He saw the fire in the horse's eyes and saw himself. In teaching the stallion to trust, Gunnar remembered how to feel again. When he finally rode through the wind-carved ridges, the village looked up in awe. But what secret from Gunnar's past would threaten to destroy everything he'd rebuilt? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like the memories Gunnar Stonefist could never quite shake. From his cabin perched on the rocky ledge, he watched the sun pierce through the grey veil, casting long shadows across the valley below. The settlement of Nordheim looked peaceful from this distance. Smoke rising from hearth fires, tiny figures moving between the wooden structures like ants following well-worn paths, Gunnar's massive hands wrapped around a steaming cup of pine needle tea, the warmth a small comfort against the mountain's perpetual chill. At 42 winters, he stood taller than any man in 3 villages, his shoulders broad enough to block a doorway. Scars mapped his arms and chest, like a living history of battles fought and barely survived. The deepest one ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of the day everything changed. His battle-worn axe leaned against the cabin wall, its blade dulled from years of splitting firewood rather than splitting skulls. The weapon that once cleaved through enemy shields now served a gentler purpose, much like its owner. Gunnar had learned to find a strange peace in the rhythm of chopping wood, the solid thunk of steel biting into timber, the sweet scent of fresh-cut pine. The cabin itself reflected his journey from warrior to hermit. Built with his own hands over 3 long winters, it sat solid and square against the mountain's face. Heavy timber walls chinked with moss, and clay kept out the worst of the wind. Inside, everything had its place, simple wooden furniture he'd crafted himself. Shelves lined with preserved foods, hunting tools, and a few precious books traded from passing merchants. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth always glowing with banked coals. Above the mantel hung his father's war horn, its carved surface worn smooth by generations of weathered hands. Gunnar never touched it anymore. Some things were better left to gather dust. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke his morning meditation. Gunnar recognized the steady clip-clop of Bjorn's old mare long before the village elder came into view around the mountain path. At 70 winters, Bjorn Greybeard moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd outlived most of his contemporaries. His white beard reached nearly to his belt, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made him the settlement's unofficial leader for 2 decades. "Morning finds you well, Gunnar?" Bjorn called as he dismounted, his voice carrying the formal greeting of their people. "Well enough," Gunnar replied, though they both knew wellness was a relative thing for a man like him. "Tea's hot if you've a mind for it." Bjorn tied his mare to the post Gunnar had installed for such visits, rare as they were. The old man climbed the few steps to the cabin's covered porch, accepting the offered cup with grateful hands. "Cold morning to be riding the mountain paths," Gunnar observed. "Aye, but there's news from the village. Astrid's youngest took sick in the night. Fever broke just before dawn, but she's asking if you've any of that willow bark remedy." Gunnar nodded, disappearing into the cabin. He returned with a small leather pouch, its contents carefully prepared and measured. In his years of solitude, he'd become something of a healer, not from any mystical calling, but from the practical knowledge of a man who'd tended too many battlefield wounds. "Tell her to steep it weak, no more than a pinch in hot water. Too strong and it'll turn the boy's stomach." Bjorn accepted the pouch, but made no move to leave. Instead, he settled into the rough-hewn chair Gunnar kept on the porch for such occasions. "This wasn't just a supply run. Something else on your mind, old friend?" "Perhaps?" Bjorn sipped his tea, savoring the warmth. "Astrid mentioned seeing smoke from the eastern ridge yesterday. Fresh campfire smoke, not from any settlement she knows?" Gunnar's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. In 3 years on this mountain, unexpected visitors had been blessedly rare. Most travelers kept to the main roads through the valley, and those who might seek him out specifically were not the kind of company he welcomed. "Could be hunters," Gunnar suggested, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Could be." Bjorn's weathered fingers drummed against his cup. "But hunting season's near over, and what game there is runs lower on the mountain this time of year." They sat in comfortable silence, two men who'd learned the value of unspoken communication. Below them, the village continued its morning routine. Women tending gardens, men preparing for the day's work, children playing in the streets. It was a good life, simple and honest. The kind of life Gunnar had once protected with sword and shield. "The boy who brings your supplies," Bjorn continued eventually. "Young Eric, sharp lad, good with horses. He mentioned something strange last week." "Strange how?" "Said he saw a rider watching from the tree line when he was coming up your path. Man on a black horse, just sitting there like he was studying the mountain. When Eric looked again, he was gone." Gunnar set down his cup with deliberate care. 3 years of peace. Perhaps it had been too much to hope for longer. In his experience, the past had a way of finding a man, no matter how far he ran or how well he hid. Eric mentioned what the rider looked like. "Tall man," he said, "wore dark furs and carried a spear." Eric couldn't make out much more from the distance, but something about him spooked the boy's horse. The description meant nothing specific to Gunnar, but it didn't need to. Men who watched from tree lines and disappeared when spotted were rarely bringing good news. In his former life, he'd been such a man more times than he cared to remember. "I appreciate the warning," Gunnar said finally. Bjorn finished his tea and stood, understanding the dismissal for what it was. Some conversations had natural endings, and this was one of them. But as he prepared to leave, the old man paused. "Gunnar, you know the village considers you one of our own, even if you choose to live apart. If trouble comes calling—" "I know." Gunnar's voice carried genuine warmth. "And I'm grateful for it. But some troubles are best faced alone." "Aye, perhaps. But remember, a man who stands alone casts only one shadow. Men who stand together can darken the whole field." After Bjorn disappeared down the mountain path, Gunnar remained on his porch, studying the landscape with new eyes. The eastern ridge where Astrid had seen smoke commanded a clear view of both his cabin and the approach routes from the valley. A good position for someone conducting reconnaissance. He walked to the cabin's eastern window and examined the sight lines. From here, he could see most of the ridge, but there were blind spots where a patient observer could remain hidden for hours. In his warrior days, he would have already been planning counter-surveillance, preparing defensive positions, gathering intelligence on potential threats, but those days were behind him, or so he'd told himself. Gunnar spent the rest of the morning in routine tasks, but his mind wandered to possibilities he'd hoped never to consider again. The leather-wrapped handle of his axe felt different under his palm, less like a tool and more like a weapon. Muscle memory stirred in his shoulders and arms, old reflexes testing their readiness. By midday, he'd made a decision. If someone was watching him, he needed to know who and why. But more importantly, he needed to ensure that whatever storm might be approaching didn't spill over into the valley below. The people of Nordheim had shown him kindness when he'd expected only suspicion. They deserved better than to suffer for his past mistakes. As the sun reached its peak, Gunnar strapped on his hunting knife and set out for the eastern ridge. The climb was steep but familiar. He'd explored every inch of this mountain in his 3 years of residence. His heavy boots found purchase on the rocky slope, his breathing steady despite the exertion. Near the ridge's crest, he found what he was looking for, the remains of a small campfire, carefully banked but still warm to the touch. Someone had indeed been watching, and recently. Hoof prints in the soft earth told the story of a single horse, unshod but well cared for. The rider had positioned himself perfectly to observe both the cabin and the main approach from the valley. But there was something else. A deliberately placed stone cairn. 3 rocks stacked in an old pattern Gunnar recognized. It was a message, one that spoke of shared knowledge and mutual understanding. Someone wanted him to know they'd been here, wanted him to understand this wasn't random. Standing there in the thin mountain air, Gunnar felt the weight of his past settling back onto his shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome cloak. 3 years of peace, 3 years of pretending he could be just another man living a quiet life. It seemed that time was coming to an end. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant snow and something else, the metallic tang that seemed to follow violence wherever it went. Gunnar had smelled it on too many battlefields to mistake it for anything else. As he made his way back down the mountain, one thought echoed in his mind like a warning bell. The past, it seemed, was finally ready to collect what it was owed. The storm came without warning, as mountain storms often do. Gunnar woke to the sound of wind, howling around his cabin like a living thing desperate to get inside. Rain lashed against the shuttered windows with the fury of 1,000 tiny hammers, and somewhere in the distance thunder rolled across the peaks like the footsteps of giants. He dressed quickly in the grey pre-dawn light, pulling on his heaviest wool tunic and leather boots. Storms like this could last for days, and he needed to secure anything that might blow away or be damaged. His small garden plot would need protection, and the chickens in their makeshift coop would be terrified. As he stepped onto his porch, the full force of the storm hit him. Wind drove rain horizontally across the mountain face, and the temperature had dropped enough that his breath misted in the air. This wasn't just an autumn squall. This was the kind of storm that changed the landscape, that carved new channels in the rock and sent boulders tumbling. Into the valley below, Gunnar had just finished battening down his shutters when he heard it, a sound that cut through the storm's roar like a blade through cloth. It was the scream of a horse, high and desperate, filled with a terror that made his blood run cold. He'd heard horses cry out in battle, in pain, in fear, but this was different. This was the sound of an animal facing death. The cry came again, carried on the wind from somewhere to the north, toward the cliff face that overlooked the deepest part of the valley. Gunnar grabbed his heaviest rope from the cabin and set out into the storm, following the sound through the driving rain. The going was treacherous. Water had turned the mountain paths into rivers of mud and loose stone. More than once, Gunnar had to catch himself against a tree or boulder to keep from sliding down the slope. But the horse's cries grew louder as he climbed, more desperate, and something in that desperation called to something deep in his chest. When he reached the cliff's edge, what he saw made his heart stop. There, suspended over a drop that would mean certain death, hung the most magnificent horse he'd ever seen. The stallion was massive, easily 17 hands tall, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb what little light the storm allowed. His mane whipped in the wind like a war banner, and even in his desperate situation, there was something regal about the way he held his head. This had to be Vindrskuggi, Wind Shadow. The wild stallion the villagers spoke of in hushed tones, the horse that had thrown every rider brave or foolish enough to try claiming him. Legend said he'd been born during a storm like this one, sired by the wind itself and blessed with the speed of the northern gales. The beast had somehow become trapped on a narrow ledge perhaps 15 feet below the cliff's edge. The stone beneath his hooves was crumbling away bit by bit, and his powerful hindquarters hung over empty air. Every movement the stallion made sent more rocks tumbling into the abyss below. He was strong enough to have climbed out if he'd had solid footing, but the storm had turned the rock face slick as ice. Gunnar lay flat on his belly at the cliff's edge, studying the situation. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to turn around and head back to his cabin. Vindrskuggi was wild, untamed, and according to village superstition, cursed. Men had died trying to capture this horse. What sense was there in risking his life for an animal that would probably try to kill him the moment it was free? But as he watched the stallion struggle, something in those dark eyes stopped him cold. There was intelligence there, yes, but also something else. A recognition of his desperate situation and a refusal to give up despite it. The horse wasn't panicking. Even facing death, he was thinking, calculating, trying to find a way to survive. Gunnar saw something of himself in that determined struggle. He tied one end of his rope around a sturdy pine tree, testing the knot twice to make sure it would hold both his weight and the horse's. The rope was strong. He'd used it for hauling timber up the mountain, but it had never been tested like this. Easy. "Boy," he called down to the stallion, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm coming down to you." Vindrskuggi's ears swiveled toward the sound, and those intelligent eyes fixed on Gunnar with an intensity that was almost human. The horse seemed to understand that help was coming because he stopped his struggling and held perfectly still. Gunnar wrapped the rope around his waist and began his descent. The cliff face was treacherous even in good weather. Rain slicked and crumbling, with handholds that gave way without warning. Every few feet he had to pause and find new purchase, his massive frame swaying in the wind like a pendulum. The storm-carved stone that would later mark this moment broke free just as Gunnar reached the ledge, a piece of cliff the size of a man's head, split off by the constant freeze and thaw of mountain weather. It tumbled past the stallion's head and disappeared into the void below. A reminder of how precarious their situation truly was. When Gunnar's boots finally touched the narrow ledge, he found himself face to face with the legendary Vindrskuggi. Up close, the horse was even more impressive, easily 1,000 pounds of muscle and sinew, with scars along his flanks that spoke of battles with wolves and bears. His breath came in great white puffs, and his nostrils flared as he caught Gunnar's scent. "Steady now," Gunnar murmured, moving slowly despite the urgency of their situation. "I'm here to help, not harm." The ledge was barely wide enough for both of them. Gunnar pressed himself against the rock face and worked his way around to the horse's side. Vindrskuggi watched his every movement, but didn't shy. Away, either from trust or because he understood that any sudden movement would send them both to their deaths. Gunnar slipped the rope around the stallion's chest, just behind the front legs, fashioning a makeshift harness. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. The real challenge would be getting the horse to trust him enough to let Gunnar guide him to safety. "This is going to feel strange," he warned, securing the rope. "But I need you to trust me." What followed was the longest 15 minutes of Gunnar's life. Inch by inch, using a combination of the rope and his own strength, he guided Vindrskuggi up the cliff face. The stallion seemed to understand what was required of him, placing his hooves where Gunnar indicated, pushing when Gunnar pulled, never fighting the rope or the man who held it. Twice, sections of the cliff gave way under their combined weight. Once Vindrskuggi slipped and nearly pulled them both back down to the ledge. But Gunnar held on, his massive hands wrapped around the rope until his knuckles went white, his shoulders screaming with the effort of supporting half a ton of panicked horse. When they finally reached the top, both man and beast collapsed in the mud, breathing hard. Rain continued to pound down on them, but they were alive. Against all odds, they had both survived. Gunnar lay on his back, staring up at the storm-dark sky, feeling every muscle in his body protest the abuse he'd just put it through. Beside him, Vindrskuggi had rolled onto his side, his great chest heaving with exhaustion. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the stallion lifted his magnificent head and looked at Gunnar with those intelligent dark eyes. There was something different in that gaze now, not gratitude exactly, but acknowledgement. They had shared something on that cliff face, something that transcended the usual relationship between man and beast. Gunnar slowly pushed himself to his feet, every movement an effort. Vindrskuggi did the same, shaking the water from his mane and testing his legs to make sure nothing was broken. The horse was muddy and exhausted, but appeared to be uninjured. "You're free to go," Gunnar said softly. "Back to the wild where you belong." But Vindrskuggi didn't leave. Instead, he stood there in the driving rain, watching Gunnar with that same intense gaze. When Gunnar finally turned and began walking back toward his cabin, the stallion followed at a distance, not close enough to be captured. but not far enough to be considered truly free by the time Gunnar reached his shelter. The word of the rescue was already spreading through the valley below. Storm or no storm, news travelled fast in small communities, and the sight of the giant carrying rope up the mountain during the worst weather in months had been noted by more than one observer. As Gunnar stood on his porch, wringing the water from his clothes, he could see Vindrskuggi silhouetted against the grey sky, perhaps 50 yards away. The stallion stood motionless as a statue, rain streaming off his dark coat, watching the cabin with unwavering attention. Something had changed between them on that cliff. Gunnar could feel it in the air, like the electric charge that comes before lightning strikes. He'd saved the horse's life, yes, but in doing so, he'd also bound their fates together in ways he was only beginning to understand. The storm raged on, but inside his warm cabin, Gunnar found himself unable to settle. Every few minutes, he found himself at the window, checking to see if the stallion was still there. And every time, those dark eyes were watching back, patient and unwavering. Outside, Vindrskuggi, wind shadow, the untamable, stood vigil in the storm. No longer entirely wild and not yet entirely free, the storm passed by midnight, leaving behind a world washed clean and strangely quiet. Gunnar woke before dawn to find Vindrskuggi still there, standing in the pale morning light like a dark sentinel. The stallion had moved closer during the night, not by much, perhaps 20 yards instead of 50, but the significance wasn't lost on either of them. Gunnar made his morning tea and stood on his porch, studying the magnificent creature that had somehow become part of his world. In daylight, he could see the horse more clearly. Vindrskuggi was indeed a marvel, perfectly proportioned despite his size, with intelligent eyes and an alertness that spoke of years surviving in the wild. But there were also signs of the hard life he'd lived, old scars along his flanks, a slight favor of his left front hoof, and a wariness that never quite left his posture. The healing poultice jar sat on Gunnar's kitchen table, its ancient clay surface worn smooth by generations of use. His grandmother had given it to him when he was barely old enough to hold it steady, teaching him the old ways of mixing herbs and tending wounds. During his years of war, that knowledge had served him well on countless battlefields. Now, looking at the stallion's muddy coat, he wondered if those same skills might serve a different purpose. Gunnar set his cup aside and walked slowly down the cabin steps. Vindrskuggi tensed but didn't flee. Those dark eyes tracked Gunnar's every movement as he approached to within 10 yards, close enough to speak in normal tones, but far enough to respect the animal's need for space. "You stayed," Gunnar observed, his voice calm and conversational. "Wasn't expecting that." The horse's ears swiveled toward him, and Gunnar could have sworn he saw understanding in those intelligent eyes. Vindrskuggi took a single step forward, then stopped, as if testing the boundaries of this new relationship. "You're hurt," Gunnar continued, noting the way the stallion held his left foreleg. "Nothing serious, but that hoof's tender. Storm probably drove you over rougher ground than you're used to." He retreated to his cabin and returned with a wooden bucket of clean water and some of the dried apples he kept for trading with travelers. Setting both on the ground between them, he backed away and sat on his porch steps. Vindrskuggi watched him for several long minutes before curiosity overcame caution. The stallion approached the offerings with the careful deliberation of an animal that had learned to be suspicious of human intentions. He sniffed the water first, then drank deeply, the first time Gunnar had seen him lower his guard enough to make himself vulnerable. The dried apples took longer to investigate. Vindrskuggi had probably never tasted anything like them, living as he did on mountain grass and whatever forage he could find. But eventually hunger won out over suspicion, and he accepted the small gift. "There's more where that came from," Gunnar said quietly. "But you'll have to trust me enough to let me look at that hoof." As if understanding the bargain being offered, Vindrskuggi took another step closer. Still wary, still ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. But closer nonetheless. Gunnar spent the morning in quiet tasks around his cabin, always aware of the stallion's presence, but never making any sudden moves. He chopped wood, the familiar rhythm of his axe biting into pine logs, and noticed how Vindrskuggi's ears tracked the sound. He tended his small garden, harvesting the last of the root vegetables before the first hard frost. He repaired a loose board on his porch railing, working with the slow deliberation of a man who had learned to find peace in simple labor. All the while he talked, not to the horse directly, but to himself, in the way a solitary man might when he had no other company. He spoke of the weather, of the work that needed doing before winter, of small observations about the mountain and its inhabitants. His voice was calm and steady, without the sharp edges that might spook a wild animal. "Had a horse once," he said as he worked on the railing. "Big bay gelding named Thunder. Carried me through more battles than I care to remember. Lost him at Ironhold Pass. Arrow took him down while I was fighting on foot." Gunnar paused in his work, memory darkening his features. "Should have died with him that day. Sometimes I think I did, and just haven't had the sense to lie down yet." Vindrskuggi had moved closer while Gunnar worked, drawn perhaps by the rhythmic sounds of construction or by something in the man's voice. The stallion now stood close enough that Gunnar could see the individual hairs in his mane, could smell the wild scent of him, pine and rain, and something indefinably free. "You know what it's like," Gunnar continued, setting down his hammer. "Being alone, trusting no one, because everyone who ever mattered is gone." He looked directly at the horse for the first time that morning. "Maybe that's why you stayed. Maybe you recognize a kindred spirit." The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Vindrskuggi's ears flicked forward, and for a moment the wariness in his dark eyes seemed to soften. By midday, young Eric arrived with Gunnar's weekly supplies. The boy was perhaps 16, with the gangly build of someone who hadn't quite grown into his height yet. His mare was a steady, reliable animal, the kind of horse bred for work rather than beauty. When she caught sight of Vindrskuggi, she whinnied nervously and shied away. "Is that—" Eric's voice cracked with excitement and fear. "Is that really Windshadow?" "His name is Vindrskuggi," Gunnar corrected gently, accepting the supplies. "And yes, I believe it is. But how did you— nobody's ever—" The boy struggled to find words for what he was seeing. "They say he's cursed, that he killed the last man who tried to ride him. They say a lot of things in the village," Gunnar observed. "Doesn't make them true." Eric stared at the stallion with the fascination of youth confronting legend made flesh. Vindrskuggi, for his part, watched the newcomers with alert interest, but showed no signs of fleeing. "He's beautiful," Eric whispered. "That he is," Gunnar agreed. "But beauty and trust are different things. Beauty you can see from a distance. Trust has to be earned step by step." After Eric left, no doubt racing back to the village with news of what he'd witnessed, Gunnar found himself alone with Vindrskuggi again. The afternoon sun was warm, despite the mountain's elevation, and both man and horse seemed content to share the peaceful silence. Gunnar retrieved the healing poultice jar from his cabin, along with a soft cloth and a small brush he'd used for grooming Thunder years ago. He set these items on the ground and backed away, letting Vindrskuggi investigate them at his own pace. "I know you're hurting," Gunnar said softly. "That hoof needs attention, and there's mud caked in your coat that could cause problems if it's not cleaned. I can help if you'll let me." The stallion sniffed at the unfamiliar objects, then looked at Gunnar with what might have been curiosity. For the first time since the rescue, Vindrskuggi took a deliberate step toward the man, rather than away. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't watching for it. But to Gunnar, it felt like a victory as significant as any he'd won on the battlefield. Trust, he knew, was not given freely, especially not by creatures that had learned the hard way that humans were more likely to bring pain than comfort. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Gunnar made another offering. Fresh hay he'd been saving for winter, spread on the ground near his cabin. Vindrskuggi approached it cautiously, but this time he didn't retreat when Gunnar remained nearby. They shared the space in comfortable silence, man and beast learning the boundaries of their new relationship. It wasn't friendship yet, that would take time, but it was something. A beginning. a recognition that perhaps they didn't have to face the world entirely alone. When darkness finally fell, Gunnar retired to his cabin, but left his door slightly ajar. Outside, he could hear Vindrskuggi moving about, not leaving but not settling either. The stallion was still deciding, still weighing whatever factors wild creatures used to make such judgments. Gunnar understood. Trust once broken was not easily repaired, and for both of them, trust had been shattered so completely that even the memory of it was painful. But sometimes, in the darkness of a mountain night, even painful memories were better than no memories at all. 3 days passed in a rhythm as old as the mountains themselves. Each morning, Gunnar would wake to find Vindrskuggi somewhere within sight of the cabin, sometimes grazing in the small meadow to the east, sometimes standing sentinel on the rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley. The stallion had established his own territory, a careful distance that spoke of caution rather than fear. Gunnar's worn leather gloves had become as familiar as his own skin over the years of mountain living. Softened by constant use and honest work, they bore the stains of pine sap, wood smoke, and earth. These were not the gauntlets of a warrior, but the tools of a man who had learned to find purpose in gentler labors. As he pulled them on each morning, they reminded him of who he was trying to become rather than who he had been. The routine they developed was simple but meaningful. Gunnar would go about his daily tasks, chopping wood, tending his garden, maintaining his equipment, while Vindrskuggi watched from his chosen distance. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, that distance had been shrinking. What started as 50 yards had become 30, then 20. This morning, the stallion stood barely 15 feet from where Gunnar split kindling for his fire. "You're curious about the work," Gunnar observed, not looking directly at the horse, but speaking in the same conversational tone he'd adopted over the past few days. "My father taught me that honest labor heals more wounds than any herb or poultice. Said a man's hands were meant for building, not just breaking." Vindrskuggi's ears swiveled toward the sound of his voice, and Gunnar caught the slight forward lean that indicated interest. The stallion was learning to associate the man's voice with safety, with the predictable rhythms of a life lived without sudden violence. As Gunnar worked, he found himself sharing stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years, tales of his childhood in the village below, of learning his father's trade as a stonemason before the wars called him away. He spoke of thunder, his warhorse, and the battles they'd fought together. But more than that, he spoke of the quiet moments, the early morning rides through peaceful valleys, the trust that had grown between man and beast over years of shared hardship. "Trust isn't something you demand," he said, setting down his axe and reaching for his water skin. "It's something you earn day by day, choice by choice. Thunder taught me that. Took him 6 months to let me ride him bareback, another year before he'd come when I called. But once that trust was there," Gunnar paused, remembering. "Once it was there, nothing could break it. Not storm, not battle, not the screams of dying men. He trusted me to keep him safe, and I trusted him to carry me home." Vindrskuggi had moved closer while Gunnar spoke, drawn perhaps by the emotion in the man's voice or by some deeper recognition of shared experience. The stallion now stood close enough that Gunnar could see the scars more clearly, white lines against the black coat that spoke of encounters with wolves, bears, and the sharp rocks of mountain terrain. "You've got stories too," Gunnar said, noting a particularly prominent scar along the horse's left shoulder. "That one looks like wolf claws. Pack probably tried to bring you down during a hard winter, but you fought them off, didn't you? Refused to go easy." The afternoon brought visitors, Bjorn and Astrid, the village blacksmith. Astrid was a woman of perhaps 40 winters, with the strong arms and steady hands of her trade. Her red hair was streaked with premature grey, and her green eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to solving practical problems. "We brought payment for the medicine," Astrid said, dismounting from her sturdy draft horse. "And to see if the stories Eric's been telling are true." She stopped short when she caught sight of Vindrskuggi, her eyes widening despite herself. The stallion had tensed at the arrival of strangers, but hadn't fled, a significant development that wasn't lost on any of them. Sweet Odin's ravens, she breathed. It really is Wind Shadow. His name is Vindrskuggi, Gunnar corrected again, accepting the small pouch of silver coins Astrid offered. And he's not a legend, just a horse who's learned to be careful around people. Bjorn studied the scene with the calculating gaze of a man who'd lived long enough to recognize significance when he saw it. The boy said the horse has been here for days. That true? He comes and goes as he pleases, Gunnar replied carefully. I'm not keeping him, but he's not leaving either, Astrid observed. That's not like the stories we've heard. They say he's never stayed near humans for more than a few minutes. Gunnar felt a flash of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. Maybe the stories are wrong. Maybe he just needed someone to not chase him for once. Bjorn's weathered features creased in something that might have been a smile. Or maybe he recognizes something in you, old friend. Animals have a way of seeing past the masks we wear. The conversation turned to practical matters, payment for the medicine, news from the village, preparations for the coming winter. But Gunnar was aware throughout that Vindrskuggi remained nearby, watching the interactions with what seemed like genuine interest rather than mere wariness. As the visitors prepared to leave, Astrid paused beside Gunnar. There's something else you should know. Strangers have been asking questions in the village. Men traveling through, claiming to be traders, but they don't have the look of merchants about them. Gunnar's hands stilled on the rope he'd been coiling. What kind of questions? About you, your habits, where you live, how often you come to the village. Eric mentioned them to his father, said they made him uncomfortable. Warriors, he thought, trying to look like something they're not. The warning sent a chill down Gunnar's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He'd been expecting this day for 3 years, but that didn't make it any easier when it finally arrived. How many? He asked quietly. 3 that we've seen, Bjorn replied. But there might be others. They split up after asking their questions, and we haven't seen them since yesterday. After his visitors left, Gunnar found himself standing in his doorway, studying the landscape with new eyes. The peaceful mountain setting suddenly felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. High ground was an advantage in some situations, but it also meant limited escape routes if someone was determined enough to corner him. Vindrskuggi seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. The stallion moved closer to the cabin, his posture alert and wary. It was as if he could smell the tension radiating from Gunnar, could sense that something had shifted in their small world. You feel it too, don't you? Gunnar said softly. The storm coming. You've got good instincts, better than mine, maybe. You know when it's time to run. But even as he spoke the words, Gunnar knew he wouldn't run. Not this time. 3 years ago, he'd fled from his past, carrying guilt and shame like stones in his pack. He'd told himself it was wisdom, that sometimes the best way to fight was not to fight at all. Now, looking at Vindrskuggi, this magnificent creature who had survived alone in the wild through strength and cunning, Gunnar felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was dead. Not bloodlust or the old hunger for battle, but something simpler and more profound, the desire to protect something precious. As evening settled over the mountain, Gunnar made his preparations with the methodical care of a man who had done such things before. He checked his weapons, counted his supplies, and studied the approaches to his cabin with a tactical eye. If trouble was coming, he would be ready. Vindrskuggi remained nearby as darkness fell, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. The stallion's presence was no longer just companionship, it was partnership. 2 creatures who had found something worth protecting in each other's company. The mountain night was full of sounds, wind through pine trees, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. But underneath it all, Gunnar could feel the approach of something else, something that would test everything they had built together in these few precious days. The dance of trust would soon become something far more dangerous. But for now, in the quiet darkness, man and horse stood watch together. No longer entirely alone in the world, the week that followed brought an unseasonable warmth to the mountain, as if the earth itself was holding its breath before winter's final assault. Gunnar found himself studying Vindrskuggi with new eyes. seeing patterns in the stallion's behavior that reminded him uncomfortably of his own. The polished shield fragment that now served as Vindrskuggi's water dish had once been part of Gunnar's war gear, a piece of steel that had turned aside. Enemy blades and arrows in a dozen battles. Now worn smooth by weather and use, it reflected the sky and clouds like a mirror. Sometimes Gunnar caught the horse staring into its surface, as if seeing something there that others couldn't perceive. "You know what it's like to be hunted," Gunnar said one morning, watching Vindrskuggi's ears constantly swivel to track sounds from the forest. Always listening, always ready to run. Never able to truly rest, because rest means death. The stallion's dark eyes fixed on him with that unnerving intelligence, and Gunnar felt a jolt of recognition. In those depths he saw his own hypervigilance, the same constant awareness that had kept him alive through years of warfare, but had also made peace nearly impossible to find. Gunnar's own trauma had driven him to this mountain, the survivor's guilt that came from making decisions that saved some while condemning others. The memory of Ironhold Pass still woke him some nights, cold sweat on his skin, as he relived the moment when he'd chosen to save the supply wagons rather than ride to his brother's aid. A tactical decision that had won the battle but cost him the only family he had left. "We're alike, you and I," he continued, settling onto a fallen log where he could watch the horse without crowding him. Survivors who can't forget what survival cost. As if understanding, Vindrskuggi moved closer, near enough now that Gunnar could have reached out and touched that magnificent neck. The horse's scars were more visible at this distance, not just the obvious ones from wolves and bears, but smaller marks that spoke of desperate escapes through thorn thickets and over sharp rocks. Each one was a story of choosing pain over death, of refusing to surrender even when surrender would have been easier. "The men asking about me in the village," Gunnar said quietly. "They're not traders. They're warriors, and they've come a long way to find me. You can smell it on the wind, can't you? The scent of metal and leather, of men who live by violence." Vindrskuggi's nostrils flared, and his head lifted slightly, a gesture Gunnar had learned to interpret as agreement or understanding. The stallion had excellent senses, honed by years of avoiding predators, both human and animal. If he was growing more restless, more alert, it meant the threat was getting closer. That afternoon brought confirmation of what Gunnar already knew in his bones. Young Eric arrived with supplies and news, his face pale with worry. "They came back," he said without preamble, barely dismounting before the words tumbled out. "The strangers." They weren't asking questions this time. They were making demands. Gunnar felt ice form in his stomach. "What kind of demands?" "They wanted to know your exact location, the best routes up the mountain, how many people you associate with." When the village elder refused to tell them, their leader, big man with a scarred face and dead eyes, said they'd find out for themselves. Said they had unfinished business with a coward who ran from his responsibilities. The description hit Gunnar like a physical blow. Scarred face, dead eyes, talk of cowardice and running. It could only be Ragnar Bloodaxe. Gunnar's hands clenched involuntarily, old calluses burning, as if he still gripped sword and shield. "How many of them?" Gunnar asked, his voice carefully controlled. "6 that I saw, but there might be more. They had the look of men who've traveled far and aren't planning to leave empty-handed." Eric's young face was tight with fear. "Gunnar, they're not just warriors, they're killers. Everyone in the village can see it." Vindrskuggi had approached during the conversation, drawn perhaps by the tension radiating from both humans. The stallion positioned himself between Gunnar and the potential threat directions, his massive body tense and ready. It was a protective gesture that spoke of instincts deeper than training, the kind of loyalty that couldn't be forced or bought. "You should leave," Eric continued urgently. "Tonight, while you still can. Take what you need and disappear deeper into the mountains. These aren't men who'll give up easily." Gunnar looked at the young man's earnest face, seeing his own son's features in the worried expression. Eric was barely old enough to be away from his mother's side, yet here he was, risking his own safety to bring warning to a man most of the village still considered an outsider. and let them turn their attention to the village when they can't find me? Gunnar shook his head. No, some things can't be outrun forever. Eric, sometimes a man has to stand and face what's coming. As evening approached and Eric departed, with reluctant understanding, Gunnar found himself alone with Vindrskuggi and the weight of approaching fate. The stallion seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, staying closer to the cabin than he had since those first tentative days. Gunnar retrieved his father's war horn from above the mantle, its carved surface cold under his fingers. The instrument had called men to battle for 3 generations, its voice carrying across countless fields where blood had watered the earth. Now it felt like a burden, a reminder of all the times he'd answered such calls and the prices that had been paid. "You know what's coming, don't you?" he said to Vindrskuggi, who stood silhouetted against the sunset like a creature from legend. Men like Ragnar don't come this far for conversation. They come for blood. The stallion's ears flicked forward, and he took a step closer, close enough now that Gunnar could feel the warmth radiating from that powerful body. For the first time since the rescue, Vindrskuggi allowed human contact, leaning slightly into Gunnar's outstretched hand. The touch was electric, a connection that transcended species and circumstance. In that moment, Gunnar felt the stallion's strength, his wildness, but also his capacity for loyalty to those who had earned it. Vindrskuggi had chosen him, just as Gunnar had chosen to risk everything for a horse he barely knew. "We've both been running," Gunnar whispered, his fingers gentle on the horse's neck. "Both been afraid to trust, afraid to stand and fight for something that matters. But maybe that's what we needed to find, something worth fighting for." As full darkness settled over the mountain, Gunnar made his decision. He wouldn't run, and he wouldn't face this alone. Whatever came with the dawn, he and Vindrskuggi would meet it together. 2 broken souls who had found in each other the courage to stop running from their past. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant campfires and the metallic tang of weapons being sharpened. Somewhere in the darkness below, Ragnar Bloodaxe was preparing for war. But on the mountain, a giant of a man and a legendary stallion stood ready to show him that some things were worth more than vengeance. The dance of trust had become something deeper, a bond forged in mutual recognition of shared trauma, and the decision to transform that trauma into strength. Tomorrow would bring violence and perhaps death. But tonight, for the first time in years, neither man nor horse faced the darkness entirely alone. The black raven feather appeared on Gunnar's doorstep like a curse made manifest. He found it at first light, perfectly placed where he couldn't miss it, sleek and dark as winter's promise, with an oily sheen that caught the pale morning sun. No wind could have carried it there so precisely. No natural circumstance could have positioned it with such deliberate intent. Gunnar picked up the feather with fingers that trembled slightly despite his efforts at control. In the old traditions, ravens were Odin's messengers, carrying word between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. But this wasn't a divine message, it was something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. Ragnar Bloodaxe had always had a flair for psychological warfare. Vindrskuggi materialized from the morning mist like a shadow given form, his dark coat still damp with dew. The stallion's eyes fixed immediately on the feather in Gunnar's hand, and his nostrils flared as if he could smell the malevolent intent that had brought it here. A low rumble escaped his throat, not quite a whinny, not quite a growl, but something that spoke of recognition and warning. "You feel it too," Gunnar murmured, crushing the feather between his fingers. The darkness gathering around us like storm clouds. The days that followed passed in a strange, heightened awareness, as if the very air had become electric with approaching violence. Gunnar found himself moving differently, thinking differently, old reflexes stirring to life after 3 years of dormancy. He checked sightlines from his cabin windows, identified potential defensive positions, and mentally catalogued every approach route that enemies might use. But more than that, he began to truly see Vindrskuggi's potential as more than just a companion. The stallion was magnificent in ways that went beyond mere beauty. His reflexes were lightning quick, his strength phenomenal, and his intelligence almost uncanny. When Gunnar moved around the cabin's perimeter, checking for signs of surveillance, Vindrskuggi moved with him, positioning himself to watch directions that Gunnar couldn't cover alone. "You're not just a horse, are you?" Gunnar said one afternoon, watching as Vindrskuggi demonstrated an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings. "You're a weapon, a living, breathing instrument of war that's been waiting for the right warrior to wield you." The thought should have been disturbing, but instead it felt like revelation. For days now, Gunnar had been wrestling with the choice between flight and fight, between the peace he'd built and the violence that was calling him back. But perhaps it wasn't really a choice at all. Perhaps this had been inevitable from the moment he'd pulled a dying horse from a cliff face and found something of himself reflected in those intelligent, dark eyes. That evening brought Bjorn up the mountain path, but the old man wasn't alone. Behind him rode Astrid and two other villagers Gunnar recognized, Magnus the fisherman and Thorn the carpenter. All four carried weapons, and their faces bore the grim determination of people who had decided to stand and fight, regardless of the odds. "We know you told us to stay away," Bjorn said without preamble, dismounting stiffly from his mare. "But some conversations can't wait for better circumstances." Gunnar felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the evening fire crackling in his hearth. These people owed him nothing. If anything, his presence had brought danger to their peaceful community. Yet here they were, armed and ready to stand with him against an enemy they barely understood. "This isn't your fight," he protested, though he could hear the weakness in his own argument, "isn't it?" Astrid's green eyes flashed with fierce determination. "They came to our village making threats. They've made it clear that anyone who's helped you or befriended you is now a target. That makes it our fight, whether we like it or not." Magnus, a barrel-chested man with arms like tree trunks, spat into the dirt. "Besides, we've heard the stories about Ragnar Bloodaxe. Man like that doesn't stop with one target. He'll keep taking and taking until someone stops him." The name hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Gunnar had hoped to keep his past buried, but it seemed the past had its own ideas about disclosure. "How do you know that name?" he asked quietly. "Because we're not as isolated as you might think," Thorn replied. The carpenter was younger than the others, perhaps 35, with the lean build of a man accustomed to physical labor. "Traders bring news, and some of that news has been about a war chief who's been gathering men and moving north. Word is, he's been asking about a giant who betrayed his own people." Gunnar closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of old guilt settle onto his shoulders like a familiar cloak. The story would be twisted, of course. Ragnar had always been skilled at reshaping truth to serve his purposes. But the core of it would be accurate enough to make Gunnar's defense sound hollow. "He's right about one thing," Gunnar said finally. "I did betray my own people. I chose tactics over blood, strategy over loyalty. I let my brother die to save a supply train." "And how many lives did that supply train save?" Bjorn asked gently. "How many battles were won because those supplies reached their destination?" "It doesn't matter," Gunnar replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Ragnar was there. He saw me choose strangers over family, and he's never forgiven me for it." Vindrskuggi had been listening to the conversation from his usual position near the cabin, but now he moved closer, inserting himself into the circle of humans with an authority that was impossible to ignore. The villagers looked at him with a mixture of awe and nervousness. They'd heard the stories, seen the evidence of his bond with Gunnar, but being this close to the legendary Wind Shadow was still overwhelming. "He's grown protective of you," Astrid observed, her blacksmith's eye noting the stallion's alert posture and the way he positioned himself between Gunnar and potential threats. "We're protective of each other," Gunnar corrected. "He's taught me something I'd forgotten, that sometimes the best way to heal from the past is to find something worth fighting for in the present." As if responding to some unspoken signal, Vindrskuggi stepped closer to Gunnar. For the first time in front of witnesses, the stallion allowed himself to be touched, leaning into Gunnar's hand with a trust that spoke of deep understanding between them. Magnus whistled low under his breath. "Sweet Thor's hammer, he really has accepted you." "More than that," Gunnar said, feeling the warm strength of the horse's neck under his palm. "He's ready to fight alongside me. Aren't you, old friend?" Vindrskuggi's ears pricked forward, and he turned his great head to look directly at Gunnar. In those dark eyes was intelligence, loyalty, and something else, anticipation. The stallion was no longer just surviving. He was ready to live, to fight, to be more than just a creature running from predators. "Then we make our stand here," Bjorn declared, his voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. "On this mountain, with this horse, and with friends who've chosen to stand with you," as the villagers departed into the gathering darkness, making their own preparations for the battle to come. Gunnar found himself alone with Vindrskuggi under a star-filled sky. The stallion remained close, his presence a comfort and a promise. "Tomorrow or the next day or soon," Gunnar said softly, "they'll come for us. And when they do, the world will see what we've become together. Not a broken man and a wild horse, but something new, something they won't expect." The wind carried the scent of distant smoke and the faint sound of metal on metal, weapons being sharpened, armor being readied. Somewhere in the darkness below, Ragnar Bloodaxe was preparing for war. But on the mountain, man and horse stood ready to show him that some bonds couldn't be broken by violence, and some truths were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. They came with the dawn, materializing from the morning mist like demons summoned from the underworld. 6 riders in dark leather and mail, their horses breathing steam in the cold mountain air. At their head rode a man who seemed carved from winter itself, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes like chips of Arctic ice and a face marked by the kind of scars that spoke of battles survived rather than lost. Ragnar Bloodaxe had changed little in 3 years. If anything, the time had hardened him further, sharpening his features to cruel angles and deepening the lines of bitter hatred around his mouth. He sat his black warhorse with the easy confidence of a man who had never known defeat, never doubted his own righteousness. But it was what hung around his neck that made Gunnar's blood turn to ice water in his veins. The bone-carving necklace was unmistakable, carved from human bone with the skill of a master craftsman, depicting the world tree Yggdrasil with its 9 realms. Gunnar had seen it before, in happier times, when it had hung around a different neck. His brother Ulf had worn it into every battle, a gift from their father before his final voyage to Valhalla. Now it was a trophy, a war prize worn by the man who had taken it from Ulf's corpse. Vindrskuggi sensed the change in Gunnar's demeanor immediately. The stallion moved closer, his dark eyes fixed on the approaching riders with an alertness that bordered on aggression. The horse could smell violence coming. It was a scent he'd learned to recognize during his years in the wild, the metallic tang of spilled blood and the sour reek of men who lived for killing. "Gunnar Stonefist," Ragnar called out as he drew rein some 30 yards from the cabin. His voice carried clearly in the crisp morning air, pitched to carry authority and menace in equal measure. The mighty warrior who hides on mountain tops while better men die for his cowardice. Ragnar! Gunnar stepped from his cabin, his hands empty but ready. 3 years of peace hadn't dulled his instincts entirely. He could read the positioning of the enemy riders, note their weapons, assess their capabilities with the unconscious skill of a veteran warrior. "You've come a long way to trade insults." "Not insults," Ragnar replied, his scarred fingers touching the bone necklace at his throat. "Truth, and to collect what's owed for the blood debt you've carried these 3 years. The words hit Gunnar, like physical blows, but it was the sight of his brother's necklace that truly shattered his composure. Ulf had never taken it off, not once in all the years Gunnar had known him. For Ragnar to possess it now meant, "Yes," Ragnar said, reading the recognition in Gunnar's face. "You understand now. Your precious brother didn't die clean in battle as you believed. He died slowly, screaming your name, begging for the help that never came because his own blood chose wagons over family. You're lying. But even as Gunnar spoke the words, he could hear the hollowness in his own voice. The timeline had never quite made sense. Reports of Ulf's death had been confused, contradictory. Gunnar had assumed it was the usual chaos of battle, the fog of war that made accurate information impossible to obtain. Am I? Ragnar's smile was a cruel slash across his weathered features. Your brother fell from his horse with an arrow in his shoulder. Not fatal, barely more than a scratch, but he was trapped under the animal when it died. 3 of us found him there, calling for his famous brother to come save him. The smile widened. We waited. We waited to see if the great Gunnar Stonefist would choose blood over duty. And when the supply wagons took priority, when you rode west instead of east, we knew what kind of man you truly were. Gunnar felt the world tilt around him as the full import of Ragnar's words sank in. Ulf hadn't died in the heat of battle. He'd been alive, trapped, possibly savable if Gunnar had made a different choice. The decision that had haunted him for 3 years, the choice between tactical necessity and family loyalty, suddenly took on a completely different dimension. You could have saved him, Gunnar whispered, the words torn from his throat like blood from a wound. We could have, Ragnar agreed, but why should we rescue the brother of a man who values strategy over kinship? Instead, we watched. We watched as he grew weak from blood loss and exposure. We listened as he called your name until his voice gave out. And when he finally died, cold, alone, abandoned, I took this as payment for the lesson you taught us all about the price of choosing duty over blood. The bone necklace seemed to gleam in the morning light, its carved surface a testament to craftsmanship and love, transformed into an instrument of psychological torture. Gunnar could see his father's hands shaping it, could remember the pride in Ulf's eyes when he'd first put it on. You murdered him, Gunnar said, his voice gaining strength as rage began to burn through the shock. No, Ragnar corrected, you murdered him. We simply failed to prevent it, just as you failed to save him. The only difference is that we were honest about our choice. Vindrskuggi moved restlessly beside Gunnar, sensing the emotional storm raging through the man he'd learned to trust. The stallion's ears were flat against his skull, and his hooves struck sparks from the rocky ground. Whatever was happening here, the horse understood that it was building toward violence. The other riders had spread out slightly during the conversation, positioning themselves to cut off potential escape routes. These were experienced warriors, men who had fought beside Ragnar in a dozen campaigns. Their faces showed the cold professionalism of killers who had learned to take pride in their work. Why now? Gunnar asked, forcing his voice to remain steady. Why wait 3 years to collect this blood debt? Because 3 years ago you still had a reputation, Ragnar replied. Men still spoke of Gunnar Stonefist with respect, even fear. Killing you then would have been about vengeance. But now, you're just a broken hermit hiding on a mountain, playing with horses like a child. Now killing you is about teaching the world what happens to men who abandon their brothers. The insult stung, but not as much as Ragnar had probably hoped. Gunnar had found something on this mountain worth more than reputation, more valuable than the respect of warriors who measured worth in blood spilled and enemies slain. You see weakness, Gunnar said quietly, his hand moving to rest on Vindrskuggi's powerful neck. But you're wrong. I've found something here you'll never understand, something worth fighting for instead of just fighting against. Ragnar's eyes flicked to the stallion for the first time, really seeing the magnificent animal that stood beside Gunnar like a guardian spirit. A horse? You think a beast will save you from what's coming? Not just any horse, Gunnar replied, feeling strength flow back into his voice as Vindrskuggi leaned into his touch. This is Vindrskuggi, Wind Shadow, the stallion no man could tame. Except he wasn't meant to be tamed. He was meant to choose his own partner. Something in Gunnar's tone must have warned Ragnar that the conversation was taking an unexpected turn. The scarred warrior's hand moved to the hilt of his sword, and his riders tensed in their saddles. Pretty words, Ragnar said. But words won't wash away the blood debt you owe. Nothing will, except your death and the deaths of anyone fool enough to stand with you. Then you'll have to take it, Gunnar replied. But know this, Ragnar Bloodaxe. You're not facing the same man who rode away from Ironhold Pass. That man was broken by guilt and shame. The man standing before you has found his strength again. The morning air crackled with tension as both groups prepared for violence. Vindrskuggi's muscles coiled like steel springs, ready to unleash the power that had kept him alive and free in the mountains for so many years. Somewhere in the distance, Gunnar could hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats, Bjorn and the villagers, coming as they had promised despite the odds against them. But for now, it was just him and Vindrskuggi against 6 armed warriors, and the weight of a blood debt 3 years in the making. The truth about Ulf's death had changed everything, transforming guilt into rage and shame into determination. Ragnar might have his brother's necklace, but Gunnar had something far more valuable, a partnership forged in trust and tempered by shared understanding. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The mountain morning was about to be baptized in blood, and for the first time in 3 years, Gunnar Stonefist was ready for war. The standoff stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. 6 mounted warriors facing 1 man and a horse in the pale morning light. Gunnar could feel time crystallizing around them, each heartbeat distinct and precious as the moment balanced on the knife's edge between words and violence. Then Ragnar smiled, a cold, predatory expression that held no warmth or humor. But not today, he said, raising his hand to signal his riders. Today is for preparation, for anticipation. The blood debt has waited 3 years. It can wait 1 more day for proper ceremony. Gunnar felt his muscles tense, ready for the attack that logic said must come. But Ragnar was already wheeling his horse around, his men following suit with the disciplined precision of veteran warriors. Tomorrow, Ragnar called over his shoulder, his voice carrying easily across the mountain air. At dawn, single combat as befits warriors of our standing. You and me, Gunnar Stonefist, with the whole world watching. And when you fall, I'll take that horse's payment for your brother's life. The riders disappeared into the morning mist as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving Gunnar alone with Vindrskuggi and the weight of approaching doom. The stallion remained tense beside him, dark eyes tracking the enemy's retreat with predatory focus. Even after the hoofbeats faded, neither man nor horse relaxed their vigilance. Gunnar's father's war horn felt heavier than ever as he lifted it from its place above the mantle. The ancient instrument was carved from the horn of some great beast their ancestors had hunted in the far north, its surface worn smooth by generations of weathered hands. Runes spiraled around its length, protection charms, victory blessings, prayers to gods whose names were older than memory. His father had carried this horn through 40 battles and never known defeat. His grandfather before him had used it to rally men against the Saxon invasion of their homeland. Now it fell to Gunnar to honor that legacy or see it die with him on a mountaintop far from the halls of his fathers. The sound of approaching riders brought him back to the present. Bjorn led a group of 8 villagers up the mountain path, all armed and grim-faced. They'd heard the confrontation from the valley below, seen Ragnar's retreat, and understood what it meant. Bjorn would bring single combat, and the stakes were higher than just 1 man's life. He's given you tonight to prepare, Bjorn observed, dismounting stiffly from his mare. That's more honor than I expected from what I've heard of Ragnar Bloodaxe. It's not honor, Gunnar replied, his eyes still fixed on the path where the enemy had disappeared. It's cruelty. He wants me to spend the night thinking about what's coming, remembering every mistake that brought me to this moment. He wants fear to do half his work for him. Astrid stepped forward, her blacksmith's hand steady on the reins of her draft horse. Then we make sure fear has no place here tonight. We prepare properly, and we make certain you go into that fight with every advantage we can give you. What followed was the longest day of Gunnar's life. The villagers transformed his isolated cabin into a fortress of preparation and support. Astrid sharpened his weapons with the skill of a master craftsman, testing edges and balance with the perfectionism that had made her the finest smith in 3 valleys. Magnus and Thorn scouted the area below, identifying the best ground for the coming. Biden ensuring no other enemies lurked in the shadows, but it was Bjorn who understood the deeper preparation required. "Come," the old man said as the sun reached its zenith. "There are things that must be said before tomorrow's dawn." They walked together to a grove of ancient pines that crowned a small rise near Gunnar's cabin. Here, sheltered from the wind and hidden from prying eyes, Bjorn had built a small fire. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, carrying with it the scent of pine pitch and something else, herbs that Gunnar recognized from his childhood, when his grandmother had performed the old rituals. "You're going to ask me to make peace with the past," Gunnar said, settling beside the fire. "No," Bjorn replied, surprising him. "I'm going to ask you to make peace with the future. The past is what it is. Nothing you do tomorrow will change what happened to your brother. But the future that's still being written." Vindrskuggi had followed them to the grove, and now the stallion stood at the edge of the firelight like a guardian spirit. His dark coat seemed to absorb the shadows, while his eyes reflected the flames, making him appear more myth than flesh. "You saved that horse," Bjorn continued, nodding toward Vindrskuggi. "Not because you owed him anything, not because it served some greater purpose, but because it was the right thing to do. That's who you really are, Gunnar. Not the guilt-ridden exile, not the tactical genius who chose duty over family. Just a man who sees suffering and acts to end it." The words hit deeper than Gunnar expected. For 3 years, he'd defined himself by his failures, by the moments when he'd fallen short of his own ideals. But Bjorn was asking him to remember the moments when he'd risen above them. "Ragnar will try to make tomorrow about the past," Bjorn said. "About shame and guilt and blood debts that can never be repaid. Don't let him. Make it about the future, about the man you've become and the life you've chosen to protect." As afternoon gave way to evening, the villagers departed one by one, each offering words of support and encouragement. But they left behind more than just good wishes. They left behind a clear message that Gunnar was no longer fighting alone. Win or lose, live or die, he would face tomorrow's challenge as part of a community that had chosen to claim him as their own. When full darkness finally settled over the mountain, Gunnar found himself alone with Vindrskuggi in the familiar space around his cabin. But solitude no longer felt like isolation. The bond between them had deepened beyond mere companionship into something approaching telepathy. When Gunnar moved, the stallion anticipated his direction. When Vindrskuggi sensed something in the wind, Gunnar found himself instinctively alert. "You know what's coming," Gunnar said softly, running his hand along the horse's powerful neck. "Single combat at dawn, Ragnar against me, with the whole world watching. If I fall..." Vindrskuggi turned his great head to look directly at Gunnar, and in those dark eyes was something that transcended animal intelligence. It was understanding, acceptance, and something else, a promise. Whatever came with the dawn, they would face it together. Gunnar spent the last hours before midnight in final preparations. He checked his weapons one more time, tested the balance of his sword and the weight of his shield. He examined his armor, simple leather and mail, nothing fancy, but well-made and perfectly fitted. Most importantly, he spent time with Vindrskuggi, not training or preparing, but simply being together. "I need you to understand something," he said, as they stood together in the starlight. "Tomorrow, when Ragnar and I meet, it has to be single combat. Honor demands it, and anything less would dishonor my brother's memory. But if something goes wrong, if there's treachery..." The stallion's ears pricked forward, and Gunnar could have sworn he saw understanding in those intelligent eyes. "If I fall, you run. You go back to the wild where you belong, where no man can ever hurt you again. Don't let them turn you into a trophy or a symbol. Stay free, stay wild, stay true to what you are." But even as he spoke the words, Gunnar knew they were hollow. Vindrskuggi had made his own choice about where he belonged, and it wasn't in the wild anymore. The horse had found something worth more than freedom. He'd found purpose. As midnight approached, Gunnar made his own final peace with the approaching dawn. He thought of his brother Ulf, not as he'd died, alone and abandoned, but as he'd lived, brave, loyal, always ready with a laugh or a word of encouragement. He thought of the villagers who had stood with him despite the danger, of the trust Vindrskuggi had placed in him, of the man he'd become during his years on this mountain. The guilt was still there, it would always be there, but it no longer defined him. Tomorrow, he would fight not as a man seeking redemption for past failures, but as someone protecting the future he'd helped build. When dawn came, Ragnar Bloodaxe would face more than just Gunnar Stonefist. He would face a man who had learned that true strength came not from avoiding failure, but from rising above it. He would face a partnership forged in mutual trust and tempered by shared understanding. The warhorn lay on the table beside Gunnar's bed, ready to sound the call to battle one more time. But first, there would be a few precious hours of peace, time to rest, to gather strength, and to prepare for whatever destiny awaited on the mountain at dawn. Outside, Vindrskuggi stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, patient and watchful. Two souls who had found each other in the darkness, ready to face the light together, regardless of what it might bring. The night was almost over. Soon, very soon, the real test would begin. Dawn came to the mountain like a blade drawn across the throat of night. The first drops of blood had not yet been spilled, but the pure white snow that blanketed the chosen battleground seemed to anticipate what was coming. Each crystalline flake caught the pale morning light, transforming the meadow below Gunnar's cabin into an arena worthy of legend. Gunnar woke before the sun touched the peaks, his body responding to rhythms older than conscious thought. Beside his cabin, Vindrskuggi stood motionless as a statue carved from shadow, his dark coat silvered with frost and his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The stallion had not moved from his vigil all night, standing guard while his human companion gathered what rest he could. The warhorn's call echoed across the valley with a voice like thunder trapped in bronze. 3 long notes that spoke of challenge accepted and battle joined, the same call that had summoned warriors to glory and death for generations beyond counting. Gunnar felt the weight of that legacy as he lifted the ancient instrument from his lips, knowing that his father and grandfather had sounded this same call in their own moments of truth. From the tree line below, Ragnar Bloodaxe emerged with the slow deliberation of a predator confident in its superiority. He had come alone, as honor demanded, but Gunnar could see his 5 remaining men, positioned at the meadow's edge, like carrion birds waiting for the feast to begin. Ragnar himself was a sight to inspire fear in lesser men, 6.5 feet of scarred muscle and battle-tested fury, armored in mail that had turned aside 100 enemy blades. But it was the bone necklace around his throat that drew Gunnar's eye, Ulf's final gift to their father, now worn as a trophy by his murderer. The carved surface seemed to pulse with malevolent life in the dawn light, a reminder of debts unpaid and brothers unavenged. "So you came," Ragnar called across the snow-covered field, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "I wondered if you might flee again, as you did at Ironhold Pass." Gunnar stepped into the meadow, Vindrskuggi moving beside him with fluid grace. The stallion's presence was not mere moral support, it was partnership, 2 beings who had learned to function as a single entity. Where Gunnar's foot touched the snow, small dark patches appeared, the warmth of his body melting the frozen crystals into something that would soon become mud, and then, inevitably, be stained red. "I'm here," Gunnar replied, his voice steady and calm. "As are you. Let's finish what was started 3 years ago." The 2 warriors began their approach across the white expanse, each step measured and deliberate. This was not a rushed charge born of rage or desperation. This was the careful dance of professionals who understood that hasty movement meant death. Vindrskuggi matched Gunnar's pace perfectly, his hooves finding purchase on the treacherous surface with the sure-footedness of a creature born to the mountains. 20 yards separated them, then 15, then 10. At 5 yards, both men stopped as if responding to some unspoken agreement. Here in this circle of trampled snow, the future would be decided. Ragnar drew his sword, a magnificent blade with runes etched along its fuller, the kind of weapon that spoke of wealth and victories. Gunnar's own sword was simpler, more functional, but it had served him well through a dozen campaigns and felt like an extension of his own arm. "Your horse cannot help you here," Ragnar said, his pale eyes fixed on Gunnar with predatory intensity. "This is between warriors, man to man. The beast can only watch you die." "He's not here to fight for me," Gunnar replied, raising his shield and settling into a fighting stance that felt as natural as breathing. "He's here to witness, to see that some bonds cannot be broken by death." Ragnar's answering laugh was like the sound of ice cracking under pressure. "Pretty words, but steel cares nothing for bonds or witnesses, only for the strength of the arm that wields it." The first exchange came without warning, Ragnar's blade sweeping toward Gunnar's head in a cut that would have decapitated a lesser warrior. But Gunnar had fought beside and against Ragnar for years before their falling out. He knew the man's patterns, his preferences, his slight tendency to favor his left side, where an old wound had never quite healed properly. Gunnar's shield took the blow with a crash that echoed across the meadow like thunder. The impact sent shockwaves through his arm, reminding him that 3 years of peaceful mountain living had not improved his fighting condition. But muscle memory was a powerful thing, and his body remembered skills that his mind had tried to forget. His counterattack was swift and precise, a thrust toward Ragnar's exposed ribs that forced the larger man to give ground. It was a small victory, but significant. It announced that this would not be the easy execution. Ragnar had perhaps expected Vindrskuggi circled the combatants at a distance that kept him clear of the violence, while maintaining perfect visual contact with Gunnar. The stallion's dark eyes tracked every movement, every exchange, as if he was studying the rhythm of battle for future reference. His presence was a constant reminder to Gunnar of what he was fighting for, not just vengeance for his brother, but protection of the new life he had built. The second exchange was longer, more complex, a series of cuts and parries that tested each warrior's speed and endurance. Ragnar pressed forward with the aggressive confidence of a man who had never lost a single combat, his blade work brutal and efficient. But Gunnar gave ground strategically, letting his opponent's aggression work against him, waiting for the opening that would inevitably come. When it did, a slight overextension as Ragnar committed too fully to an overhead strike, Gunnar was ready. His blade found the gap between mail and sleeve, drawing first blood from his enemy's sword arm. It was a shallow cut, barely more than a scratch, but the symbolism was profound. The bloodied snow beneath their feet bore witness to the fact that this fight was far from over, and its outcome far from certain. The taste of first blood seemed to awaken something primal in Ragnar Bloodaxe. His pale eyes blazed with renewed fury as he pressed his attack, his swordwork becoming more aggressive, more desperate. The shallow cut on his arm was nothing. He had suffered far worse in a dozen battles, but the symbolism stung deeper than the blade. "Lucky strike," he snarled, his breathing already beginning to labor from the intensity of their exchange. "It would be your last." Gunnar said nothing, conserving his breath for the fight. Words were weapons he no longer needed. His blade would speak for him now. But he could feel the years of peaceful mountain living beginning to tell. His arms were already growing heavy, his movements a fraction slower than they had been in his prime. Ragnar, for all his faults, had clearly not allowed himself to grow soft. The next exchange nearly ended the fight. Ragnar's blade swept low, seeking Gunnar's legs, then reversed direction in a move that spoke of hundreds of hours of practice. Only desperate reflexes saved Gunnar from a killing blow, his shield barely intercepting the strike that would have opened his throat. The force of the impact drove him to one knee in the trampled snow. "There's the coward I remember," Ragnar taunted, standing over his opponent with predatory satisfaction. Always quick to fall, slow to rise. Just like at Ironhold Pass, but Gunnar had learned patience in his years of exile. From his kneeling position he could see what Ragnar could not. Vindrskuggi had moved closer, positioned now where the stallion could intervene if necessary. The horse's dark eyes were fixed on the combat with an intensity that spoke of more than mere animal interest. He was waiting, watching, ready. Gunnar used Ragnar's overconfidence against him, rising suddenly from his crouch with an upward thrust that forced his opponent to leap backward. The move bought him space and time, but at the cost of precious energy. His sword felt heavier with each passing moment, and he could taste copper in his mouth from his labored breathing. Growing tired, brother killer? Ragnar pressed his advantage, raining down a series of blows that drove Gunnar steadily backward. Don't worry. Soon you'll have all the rest you desire. The broken sword blade that would mark the fight's turning point came not from superior skill or strength, but from the mountain itself. As Ragnar committed to a powerful overhead strike meant to split Gunnar's skull, his foot found a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. The slight slip was barely perceptible, but it was enough to throw off his timing by a crucial fraction of a second. Gunnar's counterstrike met Ragnar's descending blade at the perfect angle, and the inferior steel of his opponent's weapon, magnificent though it appeared, could not withstand the precise force applied to its weakest point. The blade shattered with a sound like breaking glass, leaving Ragnar holding nothing but a useless hilt. For a moment, both warriors stood frozen in tableau, Gunnar with his sword poised to strike, Ragnar staring at the broken weapon in his hand with the dawning realization that death was now inevitable. The bone necklace around his throat seemed to catch the morning light, casting strange shadows on the snow between them. Impossible, Ragnar breathed, his pale eyes wide with disbelief. The blade was blessed by 3 seers, tempered in the blood of enemies. Steel is steel, Gunnar replied quietly, and justice has its own strength. But even as victory seemed within reach, Ragnar's true nature revealed itself. In desperation, the scarred warrior drew a hidden dagger from his boot, a violation of the single combat oath that stripped away any pretense of honor. His throw was aimed not at Gunnar but at Vindrskuggi, calculating that the death of the horse would wound his opponent more deeply than any physical blow. Time seemed to slow as the blade spun through the air toward its target. Gunnar cried out in warning, but he was too far away, too committed to his own position to intercede. The dagger's point caught the morning light as it arced toward the stallion's chest, seeking the heart of the creature that had become more than companion, more than ally. But Vindrskuggi was no ordinary horse. Years of survival in the wild had honed his reflexes to supernatural sharpness. The stallion reared at the last possible moment, his hooves striking the dagger aside with precision that spoke of intelligence rather than mere instinct. The blade that should have pierced his heart instead skittered harmlessly across the snow. What followed was swift and final. Vindrskuggi's intervention had given Gunnar the opening he needed. As Ragnar stood defenseless, still stunned by the failure of his desperate gambit, Gunnar's blade found its mark. The thrust was clean and merciful, a warrior's death despite Ragnar's dishonorable tactics. Ragnar Bloodaxe fell to his knees in the bloodied snow, his hands clutching at the mortal wound. The bone necklace, Ulf's necklace, hung loose around his throat, its carved surface reflecting the grey morning sky. With his final breath, he spoke words that carried the weight of acknowledgement. The horse knew what I meant to do. His pale eyes fixed on Vindrskuggi with something approaching respect. Not just a beast, partnership, real partnership. And then Ragnar Bloodaxe was still, his blood joining the scattered crimson drops that marked the snow like fallen petals. The curse of the past was finally broken, the blood debt paid in full. Gunnar knelt beside his fallen enemy and carefully removed the bone necklace, holding it up to catch the morning light. After 3 years, Ulf's spirit could finally rest. The carved runes seemed to pulse with warmth, as if his brother's essence was acknowledging that justice had been served. Vindrskuggi approached slowly, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The stallion lowered his magnificent head to touch Gunnar's shoulder, not the gesture of a mount to his master, but the comfort offered by one partner to another after a battle survived together. In the distance, Ragnar's remaining men were already fading back into the forest, their loyalty dying with their leader. The threat was over, but more than that, the transformation was complete. Gunnar Stonefist was no longer a man running from his past, but someone who had faced it and emerged stronger. 3 months after the snow ran red with Ragnar's blood, the mountain meadow had transformed into something entirely different. Where violence had once marked the earth, new growth now pushed through the soil, hardy mountain flowers that bloomed despite the harsh conditions. Their bright colors a testament to life's stubborn refusal to be conquered by death. Gunnar stood at the edge of what had become known throughout the valley as the Peace Field, watching as young Eric worked with a spirited bay mare that had been deemed untrainable by 3 different horsemen. The boy's patience was remarkable for someone barely past his 16th winter, his movements careful and deliberate as he offered the skittish animal nothing but calm presence and gentle encouragement. "Remember what I taught you," Gunnar called softly. "Trust cannot be demanded. It can only be offered and accepted." Vindrskuggi grazed nearby, his dark coat gleaming with health and contentment. The legendary stallion, who had once been known as untamable, now served as both teacher and inspiration for the growing number of people who made the journey up the mountain seeking wisdom about the bond between human and horse. He was still magnificent, still powerful, but the wild edge had been replaced by something deeper: purpose. The carved wooden horse that sat on Gunnar's mantle was small enough to fit in a child's palm, but it represented something far greater than its humble size suggested. Gunnar had crafted it during the long winter evenings, working by firelight while Vindrskuggi dozed in the shelter he'd built beside the cabin. It was meant as a gift for Magnus's youngest daughter, a girl of perhaps 8 winters who had been born with a withered leg but whose eyes lit up whenever she saw the great stallion. She said it helps her. Remember that being different isn't the same as being broken, Astrid had reported when she delivered the gift. Claims it whispers to her in the night, telling her stories about horses that fly on mountain winds. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the weeks following Ragnar's death, Gunnar had struggled with what came next. For 3 years, guilt had been his constant companion, driving his choices and defining his existence. Without it, he'd felt strangely adrift, uncertain of his purpose or place in the world. It was Vindrskuggi who had shown him the way forward. The first supplicant had arrived barely a week after the blood was washed from the snow, a trader from the eastern settlements whose young son had developed an inexplicable fear of horses after a riding accident. The boy, barely 10 years old, would scream and flee at the mere sight of an equine, making the family's livelihood impossible to maintain. "I heard stories," the trader had said, hat in hand as he stood before Gunnar's cabin. "Stories about a giant who tamed the untamable, who speaks the language horses understand. My boy, he's not just afraid. He's broken inside. The healers say there's nothing they can do." Gunnar's first instinct had been to refuse. He was no miracle worker, no mystic with supernatural gifts. But when the boy had arrived the next day, small and frightened, clutching his father's hand like a lifeline, something in those young eyes had called to something in Gunnar's chest. It had taken 3 days. 3 days of patient work, with Vindrskuggi standing at the far edge of the meadow like a living mountain, never approaching, never threatening, simply being present. On the first day, the boy had been unable to even look at the stallion without tears. On the second day, he'd managed to stand in the same field without fleeing. On the third day, he'd asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, if the big horse had a name. When the family departed a week later, the boy was riding his father's pack horse with confidence and joy. The transformation wasn't magic. It was simply the result of patience, understanding, and the gentle application of trust, freely given and carefully earned. Word had spread from there, as word always does in communities where hope is a precious commodity. They came seeking healing for traumatized animals, guidance for difficult partnerships, wisdom about the ancient bond between human and horse. Some traveled for days across harsh terrain, bringing horses that bucked and bit, or animals so damaged by cruel treatment that they seemed beyond redemption. Gunnar accepted them all, charging nothing but asking everything, complete commitment to the process, absolute patience with setbacks, and the willingness to examine their own hearts for the seeds of whatever problems they faced. It's not about dominance, he would tell them, watching as Vindrskuggi demonstrated the principles through his own behavior. It's about partnership, about recognizing that the horse is not a tool to be used, but a being with its own thoughts, fears, and desires. Respect that, and everything else follows. The methods he'd developed weren't revolutionary. They were simply applications of lessons learned through 3 years of grief, isolation, and gradual healing. The same patience he'd needed to rebuild his own shattered spirit. He now offered to others, seeking to bridge the gap between human ambition and animal wisdom. Bjorn visited regularly, often bringing news from the village and updates on the wider world. The old man had appointed himself something of a chronicler, recording the stories of transformation that unfolded on the mountain and sharing them with anyone who would listen. "You've started something here," he'd said just the week before, settling into his favorite chair on Gunnar's porch. "Something that reaches far beyond horses and riders. People are learning to see animals differently, to approach relationships with patience instead of force. It's changing how we think about power itself." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Eric successfully placed a halter on the bay mare for the first time since her arrival. The boy's face glowed with pride and accomplishment, but it was the gentle way he stroked the horse's neck that spoke to the deeper lesson he'd absorbed. "She's ready," Eric announced, leading the mare toward where Gunnar stood. "Not for riding yet, but ready to trust that not all humans mean harm." Gunnar nodded approval, then looked beyond Eric to where 3 more travelers were making their way up the mountain path. A woman with a limping gelding, a grizzled veteran leading a warhorse that flinched at every sound, and a young couple whose cart was pulled by a mule that looked as stubborn as stone. More stories waiting to unfold, more partnerships waiting to be born, more proof that broken things could be made whole again. Given patience and the right kind of care, Vindrskuggi lifted his head from his grazing and looked directly at Gunnar. Those intelligent dark eyes holding depths of understanding that still amazed him. The stallion had chosen to stay, chosen to help, chosen to transform his own wildness into something that served a greater purpose. In doing so, he'd shown Gunnar that redemption wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about using the lessons it taught to build something better. As evening settled over the mountain, man and horse stood together, watching the last light fade from the peaks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that trust was stronger than fear, that patience could overcome trauma, and that the bonds forged in mutual respect could heal wounds that force alone could never touch. The wild had not been tamed, it had been transformed. And in that transformation, both had found their true strength.